The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time I tied the last line of the day. The boat creaked and groaned as I stepped off the deck, my boots hitting the wooden dock with a soft thud. The Sea Ghost wasn't much to look at, just another old lobster boat, weathered and beaten by years of salt water and hard work, but she had served me well. She still had some fight left in her, even after all these years. I ran a hand over the worn handrails, wiping the salt off my palms, my muscles sore from another long stretch of pulling traps. The docks were quiet, except for the sound of the water lapping against the pilings and the distant calls of seagulls returning to roost. The rest of the fleet had already headed in, their boats docked in neat rows. I stood there for a moment, staring out at the black water, the mist creeping in from the bay, thickening the night air. There was something peaceful about the quiet at the end of the day, when the work was done, and all you had to do was let the exhaustion take over. The world felt different when the fog rolled in. The familiar open sea suddenly became a maze of shadows and whispers, the kind of place where things could disappear without a trace, swallowed by the mist before anyone had a chance to blink. But it was nothing I hadn't gotten used to over the years. The fog, the cold, the long stretches of solitude, it was all part of the life we lived here. I grabbed my jacket off the rail and pulled it on, the weight of it familiar and comforting against the chill in the air. A few of the other lobstermen were finishing up their day too, some leaning against the sides of their boats, others making their way toward the small stretch of gravel that led up to the harbor inn. That was where we'd go to unwind after the week, to share stories, down a couple beers, and forget about the aches and pains of hauling traps all week. Tonight was no different. With a final look at the water, I turned away from the docks and headed toward the bar. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I made my way along the path, the fog already thickening around me. The dim lights from the inn ahead cut through the mist like little beacons guiding me in, but even those felt distant. The night air was thick with fog as the old wooden bar, the harbor inn, creaked under the weight of another long week. The kind of place where the floorboards groaned with every step, and the neon sign outside flickered like it was fighting a battle against the dark, salty sea breeze. It was Friday, the end of a grueling lobstering week, and the mood inside was rowdy, fueled by fatigue and the kind of camaraderie only a week of hauling traps in the cold Atlantic could build. The place smelled of spilled beer, salt water, and fried seafood, a scent that seemed permanently stuck to everything and everyone in that room. I leaned against the bar, my calloused hands wrapped around a pint of cheap beer. My throat felt dry from the salt water and the salt of the week's labor, but I didn't mind. My buddies and I were laughing about some old tale of a lobstering disaster, the kind of thing that makes you cringe and laugh at the same time. "We gotta go for a smoke," I muttered, pushing myself away from the bar. My voice was rough from all the talking and the beers, but it was the fog outside I was thinking about. Feels like the whole damn bay is closing in on us. Tommy, my younger cousin, gave a lazy nod, tossing back the last of his whiskey. "Fog's real thick tonight," he said, his voice barely rising above the hum of conversation in the bar. "Feels like it might swallow the whole damn town up." We all filed out through the back door, me, Tommy, Will, and Dave, grabbing our smokes from our jackets as we made our way toward the far side of the parking lot. The gravel crunched under our boots, and the fog hit us like a wall. It was dense, wet, and cold, and it felt like it had a life of its own, wrapping around us and sticking to our clothes. I lit my cigarette, taking a long drag. The fog wrapped around it too, twisting it into strange shapes, as if it were pulling the smoke into its depths. The glow from the bar's lights was barely visible now, swallowed by the thick mist. The trees at the edge of the parking lot looked like looming shadows in the distance, their outlines almost indistinguishable in the white haze. "So what's the deal with this fog?" Will asked, squinting through the mist. "I swear it's thicker than usual tonight." Dave shrugged and took a drag of his cigarette. "You know how it is. The sea hides things when it gets like this," he said, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a joke we'd all heard before, a superstition passed down from one generation of lobstermen to the next. A half-serious kind of joke, though. You never knew when the fog might hide something strange. But then, in the corner of my eye, something shifted in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks, my eyes adjusting to the weird light or the mist swirling in strange ways. But the longer I looked, the more it felt like something wasn't right. I turned my head, and there it was, big, dark, and moving with an almost unnatural slowness. My cigarette hung from my lips, forgotten, as my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a moose or some other wild animal. It was enormous, at least 9 feet tall. Its body thick with muscle like some bodybuilder on steroids. Its shoulders were wide, way too wide, and the hair that covered it looked matted, dark as wet pine bark. And then there was the head, conical, like some old depictions of Bigfoot. But it was the smell that hit me like a slap in the face, a thick, rancid stench that overpowered the usual salty sea air. It was sour, metallic, and almost like something dead had been left to rot in the woods for weeks. I gagged and fought the urge to choke. This wasn't the familiar ocean air at all. This was something way, way different. My gut twisted. The thing was standing at the edge of the trees, its massive form nearly blending into the shadows, and the fog seemed to shift around it. For a moment, everything froze. The world became quiet. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Tommy was the first to break the silence. Jesus, what the hell is that? His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Will's voice came next, rough with disbelief. That ain't no man, ain't nothing I've ever seen before. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The creature shifted slightly, its massive arms hanging down at its sides, rippling with muscles. Despite its size, it moved with an eerie grace, like it belonged in the forest, like it wasn't even trying to hide. And those eyes, glowing faintly, pinning me in place. I couldn't see the color, but I felt them. I felt them deep inside me, like they were searching through my soul. We all just stood there, frozen. The fog wrapped around us, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to get away from whatever the hell that thing was, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt like I was glued to the spot. Dave, to my surprise, was the first to move. He took a slow, shaky step back, his voice barely a rasp as he said, "We need to go, now." His voice was sharp, filled with urgency. I nodded, heart still pounding in my chest, and started backing away, not wanting to take my eyes off the thing in the woods, but knowing I had to. I don't know what I thought it might do if I stayed, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Will and Tommy followed, stumbling over their boots, and we all hurried toward the back door of the bar. We didn't say anything when we got inside. The bar felt too loud after the silence outside, too warm and too bright, but we were all shaken. Tommy, still wide-eyed, was the first to speak, his voice tight. What the hell was that? I took a deep breath and leaned against the bar, trying to steady myself. I don't know, I said, my voice a low murmur. But I've been out here my whole life and I've never seen anything like that. The fog outside pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in, filling the bar with an eerie glow. I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me, the cold, unsettling presence of something I couldn't explain. The ocean's fog wasn't the only thing hiding things in these parts. There were mysteries out here I hadn't even begun to understand, and I wasn't sure I ever wanted to. As we all stood there, lost in our own thoughts, I noticed a figure in the far corner of the bar. It was Old Man Phipps, a local who had lived here longer than anyone I knew. He was a fixture in the Harbor Inn, the kind of man who seemed to know everything about everyone, and more about the land and the sea than anyone cared to hear. His hands were gnarled from years of hard work, and his eyes always held a distant kind of knowing. He was watching us. I could feel it, the way his eyes didn't miss a thing, taking in the way we were standing, the looks on our faces. He took a slow sip from his glass, then set it down, his weathered face creasing into a smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Well, boys," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I reckon you've seen it, haven't you?" We froze. How did he know? Dave cleared his throat, eyes flicking nervously toward the door. What the hell was that thing? Phipps leaned forward, the dim light catching the sharp angles of his face. "You know, I've been hearing about things like that for years. Things in the woods. Things that move through the fog. There's stories, old ones. My daddy told me about them when I was just a boy. He said the fog hides things. Things that don't belong." Tommy, always eager to prove himself, couldn't hold back. "What, like a monster or something?" Phipps chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Monster? Maybe. You're not the first to see it. You're not the first to feel those eyes on you either. Over the years, I've heard stories from men who have gone out into that fog, and some of them didn't come back. Others, they came back different, quiet, like they knew something they didn't want to talk about." I suddenly felt a chill. The memory of the creature's eyes still burned in my mind. cold and searching. You mean to say people have seen this before? I asked, the words barely coming out. Phipps nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Oh yeah, you're not alone in that, son. You're just the latest in a long line of men who have encountered it. And I reckon, unless you've got a good reason to stay out of those woods, it'll find you again. The fog outside seemed to press harder against the windows, as though the night itself was closing in. We didn't say anything else, we just sat there, the weight of his words hanging in the air. There were mysteries in these parts, things buried in the fog and the trees, things that only the brave or the foolish ever got too close to. I wasn't sure I ever wanted to know more, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't be venturing outside of the boundaries of the Harbor Inn anytime soon.